Friends, imagine a world where the very sky above you, meant to be your sanctuary, becomes a swirling vortex of terror. A world where laughter, born of overconfidence, turns into a chilling silence. This isn't a dystopian novel. This is a true story etched into the annals of history by the contrails of war. It's the story of how an entire nation's air force, once dominant, was systematically dismantled, not by a single cataclysmic event, but by a relentless technological marvel that quite literally stretched the bounds of imagination. Today, we're delving into one of the most pivotal and dramatic reversals in military history. The moment German fighter pilots, once mocking unescorted American bombers, found themselves outmatched, outfought, and ultimately defeated by a single aircraft, the P-51 Mustang. This isn't just a tale of metal and engines. It's a profound narrative about innovation, the brutal realities of attrition, the psychological impact of shifting fortunes, and the enduring lesson of never underestimating your adversary. So, buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey high above the battlefields of World War II, where the stakes were nothing less than the fate of nations. Part 1. The Echo of Laughter. October 1943. The date was October 14th, 1943. High above Schweinfurt, Germany, at a staggering 15,000 feet, the air was thin, cold, and deadly. Inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf FW-190, a German fighter pilot, let's call him Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, scratched a mark onto the worn leather of his logbook. 17. Another entry, another heavy bomber destroyed. He'd just watched a B-17 Flying Fortress, its tail ablaze, spiral downwards like a dying leaf, leaving a greasy black plume against the crisp blue sky, a trail of desperation and death. Klaus wasn't alone in his grim tally. Around him, through the bubble canopy of his fighter, he saw the remaining American fortresses struggling to hold their formation, their 50 caliber machine guns spitting frantic streams of lead into an empty sky where German fighters had been only moments before. It was a macabre dance, a ritual of destruction that had become almost routine. The mathematics of aerial combat, as Klaus and his comrades knew them, were brutally simple and overwhelmingly in their favor. German fighters could choose their moment, dive from the blinding sun, unleash a devastating burst of cannon fire, and then disappear before the bomber gunners could even register their presence. Without fighter escorts, the American bombers were, in the starkest terms, little more than expensive, slow-moving targets. Their defensive firepower, though formidable in theory, was easily fragmented by coordinated attacks. That morning, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses had dared to cross into German airspace, their mission to obliterate the critical ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. These factories were the linchpin of the entire German war machine, producing the precision components necessary for everything from tanks and artillery to aircraft engines. The Allied High Command knew their destruction could cripple German military production. But the cost was immense. By sunset on that grim day, 60 of those magnificent flying machines would never return to England. Another 17 were so severely damaged they were written off upon landing. Over 600 American airmen were killed or captured. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had a chilling name for it: a turkey shoot. The Americans, in their somber reflection, called it Black Thursday, the darkest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. The triumphs of the German pilots were, for a time, absolute. Men like Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, older brother of the legendary Adolf Galland, Major Walter Dahl, and Hauptmann Heinz Knoke had perfected the art of bomber interception into a science of destruction. They had developed and refined tactics over months of successful combat, designed specifically to exploit every weakness in the formidable, yet ultimately vulnerable, American bomber formations. The standard American combat box formation, a carefully orchestrated arrangement of 18 to 21 bombers in a three-dimensional defensive pattern, was built on the premise that concentrated defensive firepower could ward off any fighter attack. Each B-17 bristled with 1350 caliber machine guns, theoretically covering every possible angle of approach. In theory, no German fighter should have been able to get close, but theory, as is often the case in war, collided with the brutal anvil of reality. German pilots, through relentless observation and combat experience, had identified critical weaknesses. There were blind spots, particularly in the nose of the B-17. Ammunition supplies, while seemingly vast, were finite and could be exhausted during prolonged engagements. And, perhaps most importantly, there was the psychological impact of sustained, terrifying attacks. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, commanding 5, Chettin JG or 11, was a master of the head-on attack, a tactic that exploited the B-17's weakest defensive position. He had honed his technique with deadly precision. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, meaning directly in front and slightly above, he would dive through the formation at an astonishing 400 miles per hour, firing a 2-second burst directly at the cockpit and engines, then breaking away before the top turret gunners could even track him. He had shot down his first heavy bomber, a B-24 Liberator named Maisie, on February 26, 1943, and by October he had accumulated 16 more. His method was so effective, so psychologically crippling, that it spread like wildfire among German units. The statistics offered stark validation for German confidence. During the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, the Luftwaffe had claimed 60 bombers, representing a staggering 16% of the entire attacking force. American losses were so severe that deep penetration raids had to be suspended for weeks, a tacit acknowledgement of defeat in the face of overwhelming odds. When they resumed with the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th, the results were even more devastating. 77 bombers lost or written off, over 600 airmen killed or captured in a single day. Other tactics further compounded American misery. Major Joseph Gasp, Gruppe Commander of Sektorein's JG-11, developed the company front attack. This involved 8 FW-190s approaching in a line abreast, saturating the bomber's defensive fire with multiple simultaneous targets. Imagine being an American gunner, faced with 8 deadly fighters hurtling towards you at a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour. You had mere seconds to choose a target, if you could even steady your shaking hands, and often, in the ensuing panic, you would fire wildly into empty sky, achieving nothing but depleting precious ammunition. The psychological impact was devastating, a paralyzing fear that froze crews and shattered formations. The fundamental root of American vulnerability lay in a simple, unavoidable physics problem: range. No Allied fighter available in 1943 possessed the endurance to escort bombers deep into Germany. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American escort fighter, was a magnificent brute of an aircraft, powerful and rugged, but its combat radius was a mere 375 miles with external drop tanks. This was enough to reach the German border, perhaps, but no further. The twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin booms, could fly further, but it suffered from crippling mechanical problems at high altitude in the brutal European cold, with engines seizing and controls freezing. This critical limitation meant that American bombers, having flown the initial, relatively safer portion of their missions under escort, would then enter the most dangerous phase, the heart of Germany, completely alone. German fighters, ever vigilant, simply waited beyond the range of the Allied escorts, then struck with concentrated, overwhelming force. Luftwaffe pilots called the point where Allied fighters turned back the golden moment. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, who would claim an astounding 206 victories before his death in October 1943, vividly described the tactic in his recorded accounts. We tracked the bomber streams on radar, calculating exactly where their escorts would turn back. The moment the little friends left, we pounced. The bombers knew what was coming. You could see them tighten their formations, but it was futile. This escort limitation created a deadly arithmetic. A B-17 formation might face 4 hours of brutal combat over enemy territory, but only a precious 90 minutes with fighter protection. German fighters, by contrast, could attack, land, refuel, rearm, and then attack again while the American bombers were still struggling homeward, often limping and badly damaged. Some Luftwaffe pilots flew 3 or even 4 sorties against a single raid, multiplying their combat effectiveness and ensuring a continuous gauntlet of aggression. The skies over Germany in late 1943 were a hunting ground, and the unescorted American bombers were quite literally sitting ducks. The laughter from the German cockpits was not cruel, but simply the natural expression of supreme confidence in their overwhelming advantage. Little did they know, however, that this moment of triumph would soon give way to an epical shift. A change so profound that within 4 short months the laughter would cease, replaced by a desperate, chilling silence. Part 2. The Whispers of Change. The Birth of the Mustang. The story of how this devastating imbalance was corrected begins not with an American initiative, but with a plea from a desperate ally. In April 1940, as the shadows of war lengthened over Europe and Britain stood defiantly alone, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation in the United States. They weren't looking for a miracle. They were simply seeking additional P-40 fighters, sturdy but somewhat dated aircraft, to bolster their depleted Air Force. But North American Aviation, a company known for its bold vision, had a far more ambitious proposal. Instead of merely building more P-40s under license, they offered to design and build an entirely new fighter aircraft from scratch in an astonishingly short span of just 120 days. It was an audacious promise, bordering on the impossible, but one they were determined to keep. The result was the NA-73X prototype, which first took to the skies on October 26, 1940. It was a remarkable achievement in rapid development, a testament to American industrial ingenuity and a culture of relentless problem-solving. This early Mustang was powered by an Allison WW2 engine, and in its initial form, it excelled at low altitude, proving itself a nimble and effective dogfighter in the lower strata of the air. The Royal Air Force, RAF, receiving these early variants, found them valuable for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, roles where their exceptional range and low-altitude performance proved highly beneficial. However, above 15,000 feet, precisely where bomber escort was most critically needed, the Allison-engined Mustang struggled. Its performance at those higher altitudes was marginal, leaving it unsuitable for the strategic escort role that the Allied bomber fleets desperately required. The true transformation that would irrevocably alter the course of the air war, however, came from an unlikely yet profoundly impactful marriage of American airframe design and British engine technology. In April 1942, a pivotal moment occurred when Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew an Allison-engined Mustang. Harker was a man of keen perception and deep understanding of aerial dynamics. The moment he landed, he immediately recognized the Mustang's immense, untapped potential. The airframe, he observed, was superb, aerodynamically cleaner and more efficient than even the legendary Spitfire. Its lines were graceful, its construction robust. What it lacked, he concluded, was not inherent design, but simply a better engine. Harker's genius lay in his simple yet revolutionary suggestion. Fit the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine. This was no ordinary engine. It was the same powerful, two-stage supercharged power plant that provided the latest Spitfire variants with their formidable high-altitude performance. The Merlin 61 was a technological masterpiece, capable of maintaining high power output even in the thin air of the stratosphere. The first Merlin-powered Mustang, designated the P-51B by the Americans and the Mustang III by the British, took to the skies in October 1942. Exactly 2 years after the prototype's maiden flight. The results were nothing short of extraordinary, almost unbelievable. The maximum speed of the Mustang shot up from a respectable 390 mph to a blistering 440 mph. But, more importantly, its performance above 20,000 feet, which had previously been marginal, was transformed into something truly exceptional. The service ceiling, the maximum altitude at which the aircraft could effectively operate, jumped dramatically from 31,000 feet to an astounding 42,000 feet. This was a game-changer. It meant the Mustang could not only climb with the heavy bombers, but could also engage German fighters at their preferred combat altitudes, often even above them, giving it a crucial tactical advantage. This marriage of American mass production capability with cutting-edge British engine technology had created something neither nation could have achieved alone in such a short time frame. It was a testament to the power of cross-border collaboration driven by a common existential threat. Yet, what truly made the P-51B revolutionary wasn't just its newfound performance. It was its unprecedented range. This was the secret ingredient, the factor that would break the Luftwaffe's stranglehold on German airspace. The Mustang's incredible endurance stemmed from 3 interconnected factors: a trifecta of engineering brilliance, its exceptional aerodynamic efficiency, derived primarily from its innovative laminar flow wing, its intelligent internal fuel capacity, and its ability to carry external drop tanks without suffering a severe degradation in performance. The laminar flow wing, a design marvel conceived by North American's brilliant aerodynamicist Edgar Schmood, was the cornerstone of this efficiency. Unlike conventional wings, which experienced a turbulent breakdown of airflow relatively early along their surface, the laminar flow wing maintained smooth, undisturbed airflow much further back. This seemingly subtle difference drastically reduced drag by nearly 30%. a colossal improvement that translated directly into phenomenal fuel efficiency. To put it into perspective, while a P-47 Thunderbolt might consume a hefty 100 gallons of fuel per hour in cruise flight, a P-51, cruising at the same speed, required only about 65 gallons. This 35% reduction in fuel consumption was absolutely critical for extended missions. While the P-51's internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons was less than the P-'s 305 gallons, its far lighter and more aerodynamically efficient airframe meant it could travel much further on less fuel. The real magic, however, came with the addition of external drop tanks. In early 1944, when two 75-gallon drop tanks were added to the P-51B, its combat radius immediately extended to an impressive 650 miles. This was enough to reach targets deep within Germany and return, but the engineers weren't satisfied. In March 1944, even larger 108-gallon tanks were introduced, stretching the Mustang's combat radius to an incredible 850 miles. This was the holy grail of fighter range. It meant the Mustang could fly all the way to Berlin, engage in combat for a critical 20 minutes over the target, and still have enough fuel to make it back to its base in England. No other single-engine fighter in the world could match this unprecedented combination of range and performance. The P-51 Mustang had arrived, and with it, the golden moment of the Luftwaffe was about to be irrevocably shattered. The whispers of change were about to become a roaring storm. Part 3. The Golden Moment Reversed. First Encounters. The P-51's journey from drawing board to battle-winning weapon was remarkably swift, driven by the sheer desperation of the Allied air forces. In November 1943, even as the last echoes of the Black Thursday losses still haunted the 8th Air Force, a glimmer of hope arrived. The 354th Fighter Group, affectionately nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group, received the very first P-51Bs. Based at Boxstead in Essex, England, they were technically part of the 9th Air Force, which typically focused on tactical support, but their strategic importance was immediately recognized. They were swiftly tasked with supporting the 8th Air Force's vital strategic bombing missions deep into Germany. Their commander, Colonel Kenneth Martin, faced an unenviable challenge. He had mere days, not weeks or months, to convert his experienced pilots from the sturdy but short-legged P-47 Thunderbolts to this sleek, unfamiliar new fighter. The pilots, accustomed to the raw power and robust resilience of the Thunderbolt, approached the Mustang with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, who would later command the renowned 353rd Fighter Group, flew one of the very first orientation flights. His recollection of that moment perfectly encapsulates the immediate impact of the new aircraft. The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something special. The Mustang handled like a sports car compared to the truck-like Thunderbolt. It was responsive, fast, and most importantly, it could fly forever. The initial trepidation quickly dissolved into awe. Pilots who had grown accustomed to the limitations of their P-47s suddenly felt a surge of exhilaration, a sense of boundless possibility. The P-51B's first taste of combat came on December 1, 1943. A relatively cautious fighter sweep over Belgium and France. This initial mission was more about familiarizing pilots with the aircraft in a combat environment than engaging in heavy dogfighting. The real test, however, was just around the corner. The first escort mission followed just 4 days later, on December 5th, accompanying bombers to Amiens, a comparatively short-range raid. 16 P-51Bs accompanied the bombers, acting more as a combat test flight than a full-scale escort mission. They encountered no enemy fighters, a quiet debut that nonetheless proved the aircraft's basic suitability for high-altitude escort work. The pieces were slowly but surely falling into place. Then came December 13th, a date that would be etched into the memory of both Allied and German airmen. This was the first true long-range escort mission for the P-51s, accompanying bombers all the way to Kiel, a journey of 490 miles from their base. This was a distance previously considered impossible for any Allied single-engine fighter. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound, a tectonic shift in the aerial landscape. Over northern Germany, Luftwaffe pilots rising to intercept what they fully expected to be unescorted bombers were utterly shocked to encounter aggressive American fighters deep within Reich territory. Their operational briefings, their intelligence reports, their very understanding of air combat had been based on the inviolable sanctity of German airspace beyond the reach of Allied escorts. Now, this sacred sanctuary was being violated with impunity. The final week of 1943 saw intensified operations as the 8th Air Force, sensing a profound shift, aggressively tested the Mustang's burgeoning capabilities. On December 20th, P-51Bs escorted bombers to Bremen, claiming 3 German fighters without a single loss. The Luftwaffe, still reeling and adjusting to this unprecedented new threat, continued to rely on their standard, well-practiced tactics of waiting for the escorts to turn back. But the escorts weren't leaving. Initially, German pilots often mistook the P-51B for the more familiar P-47 at a distance. They anticipated, with customary confidence, that these little friends would turn back at their usual golden moment. But as the Mustangs relentlessly continued their eastward trajectory, pushing far beyond the P-47's maximum range, confusion rapidly escalated into outright alarm. Intercepted radio chatter, a trove of intelligence for Allied listening posts, vividly revealed the mounting panic within the German ranks. German air traffic controllers repeatedly demanded confirmation of fighter types and positions from their pilots, utterly unable to believe that Allied escorts had penetrated so deeply into Germany. The disbelief was palpable, almost desperate. Major Klaus Meitusch, commanding 3 JG-26, recognized the strategic implications with chilling clarity immediately after landing from a December 30th interception. On that mission, Mustangs had relentlessly pursued his fighters all the way back to their landing approach, a brazen act of aggression previously unthinkable. He reportedly gathered his pilots and delivered a stark, unforgettable message. The air war has fundamentally changed. Our sanctuary no longer exists. The laughter, once so resonant in the German cockpits, was beginning to die, replaced by a growing, uneasy silence. The hunter was becoming the hunted. The psychological tides of the air war had turned, and the shock waves were just beginning to spread across the Third Reich. Part 4. Berlin and the Breaking of the Myth, March 1944. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang had, in the span of just a few weeks, shifted the balance of power. But the true, undeniable proof of its transformative impact would be etched into history on March 4, 1944. High above Brandenburg, at a dizzying 25,000 feet, through scattered clouds, the sprawling outline of Berlin was clearly visible, the capital of the Reich, the heart of Nazi Germany. the city that Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring had famously and foolishly sworn would never see an enemy aircraft. But above it, in perfect unwavering formation, flew 660 American heavy bombers, and surrounding them, weaving intricate protective patterns, were scores of single-engine fighters bearing the unmistakable American markings. The first American fighter escort to Berlin represented more than a mere tactical achievement. It was a psychological demolition of German invincibility. It was a brazen, defiant middle finger to Göring's empty boasts and a profound blow to the morale of an entire nation. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commanding the legendary 4th Fighter Group, had led his 3 squadrons of P-51Bs on this historic 100-mile round trip. His group had received their Mustangs just days before, on February 28, 1944. And, in an astonishing display of rapid conversion and combat effectiveness, just 4 days later, they accomplished what German leadership had deemed utterly impossible. The speed of this transition was staggering, a testament to the Mustang's intuitive handling and the skill of American pilots. For the Luftwaffe pilots scrambling from their airfields, rising to intercept, the sight was incomprehensible. A nightmare made real. They had been repeatedly assured that Allied fighters could never reach Berlin. It was too far, an insurmountable distance for any single-engine aircraft. Yet there they were, sleek, aggressive, and seemingly fresh after flying over 500 miles, while the German defenders, having just taken off, were already running low on fuel, their limited range a sudden fatal disadvantage. The cognitive dissonance must have been immense, a shattering of deeply held beliefs. The combat that ensued was savage, desperate, and one-sided. The Luftwaffe committed over 200 fighters to defend its capital, a formidable number, but they faced not exhausted, fearful bomber gunners, but fresh, eager Mustang pilots. These American pilots possessed the crucial altitude advantage and were flying a superior aircraft perfectly suited for high-altitude combat. The 4th Fighter Group alone, in that single day, claimed 15 victories. More significantly, countless German attacks on the bomber formations were broken up and dispersed before they could press home, saving untold American lives and ensuring the bombers reached their targets. For the American pilots, the P-51B was nothing short of a revelation in fighter design. Captain Donald Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who would go on to become one of the war's top Mustang aces with 21.8 confirmed victories, described his first combat in the type with a sense of almost spiritual fulfillment. The Mustang gave us everything we dreamed of: speed to catch any German fighter, maneuverability to dogfight with them on their own terms, and range to go anywhere the bombers went. It was truly a pilot's airplane. Life inside the cockpit of a P-51B was cramped, but efficiently designed. The pilot sat behind an inline engine, which provided excellent forward visibility, a marked improvement over the radial-engined P-47, which blocked much of the view ahead. While the later P-51D model would introduce the iconic bubble canopy, further improving all-around visibility, even the B model's greenhouse canopy offered a good panoramic view, critical for spotting enemy aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Powell of the 352nd Fighter Group vividly recalled the immense physical demands of these long missions. 6 hours in a Mustang meant 6 hours on oxygen above 10,000 feet. Your mouth would be cotton dry from the oxygen mask. Your back would ache from the parachute and dinghy pack you sat on, acting as your seat cushion. Your neck would be sore from constantly swiveling, scanning the sky for enemy fighters, the constant threat of attack. But we had the capability to do the job, and that, fundamentally, made all the difference. The sheer endurance of these pilots, combined with the endurance of their machines, was a critical, unsung factor in the Mustang's success. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin triggered an immediate and profound crisis within the Luftwaffe High Command. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, a man notorious for his inflated ego and denial of inconvenient truths, initially refused to believe the reports. When confronted with undeniable proof, gun camera footage from German fighters clearly showing P-51s over the capital, he is famously, though perhaps apocryphally, reported to have said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." While the precise quote lacks primary source documentation, its essence undeniably captures the profound shock and strategic despair experienced by the German leadership. It was a moment of stark, brutal realization that their perceived invincibility was an illusion. The tactical implications were devastating. Every single assumption about Reich defense, every strategic plan, had been based on the absolute sanctuary of German airspace beyond the range of Allied escorts. Training fields, crucial assembly areas for new aircraft, and vital aircraft factories had been deliberately located deep in central Germany, specifically because they were thought to be safe from fighter attack. Now, this core tenet of German defense was shattered. American fighters could freely strafe airfields near Prague, engage German fighters over Munich, and escort bombers to literally any target in the Reich. The war, which had once been fought on Germany's periphery, had now arrived squarely on its doorstep, and there was nowhere left to hide. Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's top aces with an incredible 275 victories, a man intimately familiar with the brutal realities of air combat, recognized the strategic shift with chilling clarity. His words perfectly encapsulate the Mustang's impact. The Mustang didn't just extend the bomber offensive, it transformed it. We could no longer choose when and where to fight. They brought the battle to us on their terms whenever they wished. The laughter was gone. In its place, a grim, foreboding silence settled over the German fighter bases. A silence filled with the terrible understanding that the sky itself, once their domain, had been irrevocably lost. Part 5. The Unrelenting Hammer, Attrition and New Tactics. With the P-51 Mustang now patrolling the skies deep over Germany, the strategic dynamics of the air war underwent a radical and irreversible transformation. The Luftwaffe, once dictating terms, was now forced into a desperate, reactive stance. They attempted various tactical responses to counter the omnipresent Mustang threat. Sturmstaffeln, or storm groups, were formed, comprising heavily armed and armored FW-190s, specifically designed to be flying tanks. Their mission was to break through the American fighter screens and attack the bombers at extremely close range, hoping to destroy them with heavy cannon fire. But these lumbering assault fighters, weighed down by their armor, became easy prey for the nimble, fast, and aggressive Mustangs. Their slowness and lack of maneuverability made them targets, not hunters. The Germans also tried mass attacks, committing entire fighter groups to overwhelm the bomber escorts simultaneously. However, the American fighters, now with superior numbers and performance, were able to counter even these concentrated efforts. The P-51s, operating in larger, better coordinated formations, could break up German attacks before they coalesced. Picking off the more vulnerable Sturm fighters and disrupting the cohesion of the massed formations. The full, devastating demonstration of this transformed dynamic came between February 20th and 25th, 1944, a period famously known as Big Week. The 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, a massive, coordinated air offensive specifically targeting German aircraft production facilities. For the first time, P-51s provided escort throughout the entire depth of the raids, staying with the bombers all the way to their targets and back. In just 6 days, the Americans flew an astonishing 3,300 bomber sorties and 3,773 fighter sorties. The losses were still heavy. The Americans lost 226 bombers, but the German cost was far, far higher. Allied fighters claimed over 500 German fighters destroyed in the air. More critically, the Luftwaffe lost irreplaceable veteran pilots, highly skilled individuals who had years of combat experience and were impossible to replace. This wasn't just about destroying aircraft. It was about destroying the Luftwaffe's very capability to fight. The American strategy had shifted from simply bombing targets to actively seeking out and destroying the Luftwaffe itself. General James Doolittle, the celebrated commander of the 8th Air Force, issued revolutionary new orders in January 1944. Allied fighters were to actively seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, rather than merely staying close to the bombers. This was a radical departure from previous doctrine, which prioritized keeping fighters tethered to the bomber stream. Captain John Godfrey of the 4th Fighter Group, an ace pilot, described these new aggressive tactics. We'd escort the bombers to the target, but once they dropped their bombs, we'd go looking for trouble. We'd dive to the deck, shoot up airfields, catch German fighters landing or taking off. We weren't just protecting, we were hunting. This aggressive posture meant that German pilots were no longer safe even when returning to base. The entire Reich had effectively become a combat zone. The mathematics of attrition now favored the Allies overwhelmingly, and the disparity was horrifying for the Germans. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 311 pilots. In February, that number soared to 2,121. By March, it was 2,115. These catastrophic losses included many irreplaceable expert and veteran pilots, individuals with years of combat experience whose skills simply could not be replicated. American losses, while still significant and tragic, could be rapidly replaced by the vast training programs of the United States, which were churning out an astounding 11,000 new pilots monthly. The industrial and human resource scales were tipped overwhelmingly in favor of the Allies. The P-51 Mustang also showcased American industrial and technological superiority in ways that went beyond mere range and speed. One significant advancement was the K-14 computing gun sight, introduced in late 1944. This gyroscopic sight provided Mustang pilots with a substantial advantage in deflection shooting, the art of leading a moving target. It automatically calculated the necessary lead based on range and rate of turn, dramatically improving accuracy. While German pilots relied on older, cruder fixed sights, American pilots had a high-tech advantage that made their bursts of fire far more lethal. Furthermore, the Mustang's armament of 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, while less powerful per round than the larger German cannon, offered distinct advantages in ammunition capacity and rate of fire. A P-51 carried an impressive total of 280 rounds, enough for nearly 30 seconds of continuous firing. German fighters, typically armed with 20mm or 30mm cannons, usually carried ammunition for less than 10 seconds of continuous fire. In a prolonged dogfight, this difference was crucial. American pilots could afford to take more shots, to hose down an area, to make multiple passes. German pilots, by contrast, had to be devastatingly precise with their limited ammunition. This tactical disparity added another layer of stress for the German pilots and a significant advantage for the Americans. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's most highly decorated aces with 220 victories, a man known for his blunt honesty, noted this qualitative difference. The Mustang was not just another fighter. It was a weapons system. Everything about it was optimized for its mission. We had excellent aircraft, but nothing that combined all elements so effectively. The Mustang was a holistic design, a perfect synthesis of airframe, engine, armament, and pilot-centric ergonomics, all focused on winning the air war. Behind these cold statistics lay human tragedy on an unprecedented scale. Young men on both sides, many barely out of their teens, fought desperate battles 6 miles above the earth, in temperatures that could plummet to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The lucky ones died instantly. Others endured horrific burns, traumatic amputations from cannon shells, or slow, agonizing deaths in parachutes riddled with bullet holes. Lieutenant William Wisner of the 352nd Fighter Group recounted a particularly harrowing incident on March 8, 1944. He had just shot down a Bf-109 and watched its pilot bail out. His parachute opened, Wisner recalled, but he was on fire. I could see him trying to beat out flames on his flight suit as he descended. There was nothing anyone could do. Such sights were not uncommon, etching indelible scars on the minds of those who survived. German pilot Walter Schuck of JG-7, who initially experienced the Luftwaffe's dominance, described the terrifying shift in the nature of combat. In 1943, we were knights of the air, jousting with bombers in something approaching fair combat. By 1944, we were being pursued relentlessly. Mustangs would follow us down to our airfields, circle overhead while we tried to land, then attack. There was no safety anywhere. The psychological toll was devastating. Luftwaffe pilots who had been brimming with confidence in 1943 became increasingly fatalistic by mid-1944. Letters home, censored by German authorities but preserved in archives, revealed a deepening despair. One pilot wrote in April 1944, a chilling prophecy. "We take off knowing most of us won't return. The Americans are everywhere, always above us, always with more fuel, more ammunition." The laughter had evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of a war that was rapidly turning against them, not just in the air, but in the very souls of its combatants. Part 6. The Noose Titans. Oil, D-Day, and Ground Attack. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the P-51 Mustang's unprecedented range enabled a strategic campaign that would ultimately choke the German war machine. The systematic destruction of oil production became a primary objective for Allied bombers, now protected by their long-range escorts. Synthetic oil plants at Leuna, Pöhlitz, and Brux, previously beyond effective escort range and therefore considered relatively safe, now faced regular, precision attacks with full fighter protection. The impact was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Aviation fuel production, the lifeblood of any modern air force, plummeted dramatically. From 175,000 tons in April 1944, it crashed to just 30,000 tons in July, and then a mere 10,000 tons in September. This wasn't just a reduction, it was a total collapse. training flights essential for maintaining pilot proficiency and introducing new recruits to the complexities of aerial combat, were first curtailed, then eliminated entirely. New German pilots arrived at combat units with as few as 50 hours of total flight time, a shocking disparity compared to American pilots who often had 300 to 400 hours before seeing combat. This created a vicious cycle. Inexperienced pilots were easily shot down, further depleting the already dwindling pool of experienced airmen, and the lack of fuel meant there was no way to properly train replacements. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-7, a unit that would operate the world's first operational jet fighter, the Mi-262, described the crisis with bitter frustration. We had the world's first operational jet fighter, the Mi-262, capable of 540 Mach, a marvel of engineering, but we could barely fuel them for combat missions. I watched helplessly as dozens of these superb aircraft sat idle, while Mustangs roamed freely overhead. The technological advantage of the jets was rendered moot by the sheer lack of fuel to get them off the ground. June 6, 1944, D-Day provided the most stark and undeniable proof of the complete reversal of air superiority. On that momentous day, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe managed a paltry 319 sorties over France. This contrasted with an overwhelming 14,674 Allied sorties. Only 2 German fighters, 2 solitary specks against an ocean of Allied air power, appeared over the invasion beaches. Mustangs and other Allied fighters had established such absolute dominance that the invasion proceeded under an aerial umbrella virtually unchallenged by German aviation. Oberleutnant Josef Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, flew one of those 2 legendary sorties with his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk. Making a single, defiant strafing run along Sword Beach, Priller later described the mission with grim humor as suicide disguised as duty. They survived only because the sheer audacity of their appearance so surprised the Allied fighters overhead that they failed to react to the lone pair of FW-190s until they were gone. The incident perfectly illustrated the extent of the Luftwaffe's impotence. Their presence was so unexpected because it was so rare. The Mustang's role extended far beyond mere escort duties. With the Luftwaffe cleared from the skies, P-51 pilots became adept at active fighter bombing and ground attack. They became masters of train busting, destroying locomotives and railway infrastructure with their 650 caliber machine guns, crippling German logistics. A single Mustang could carry 2 500-pound bombs, or 10 5-inch rockets in addition to its guns, making it a formidable ground attack aircraft. This versatility meant that even when there were no German fighters to engage, the Mustangs were still actively participating in the destruction of Germany's war machine. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, flew P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group. On October 12, 1944, he famously shot down 5 Bf-109s in a single mission, an ace-in-a-day achievement. But he also described the moral complexities of the Mustang's expanded role. We went from protecting bombers to attacking anything that moved. We'd strafe trains knowing they might be carrying civilians. It was total war, and the Mustang gave us the capability to take that war anywhere in Germany. The lines between military and civilian targets blurred in the relentless push for victory, a grim consequence of total aerial dominance. Germany's technological response, however brilliant, came too late to stem the tide. In the twilight of the war, revolutionary jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet began to appear. The Me-262, capable of an astonishing 540 km/h, was nearly 100 mm faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, these jets could slash through bomber formations and escape before Mustangs could even react. Yet, even these technological marvels, born of desperation and genius, couldn't reverse the overwhelming numerical and strategic disadvantage. General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland, flying the Me-262 with JV-44 in 1945, famously shot down 7 aircraft, but he recognized the futility of their efforts. "We were like a few tigers facing hundreds of wolves," he lamented. For every Me-260, the Americans had 50 Mustangs, and these Mustangs had learned to exploit the jet's weaknesses. The early jet engines of 1944-45 were temperamental, requiring careful throttle management and long runways for takeoff and landing. Mustang pilots, ever adaptable, learned to patrol over German airfields, attacking the jets when they were most vulnerable, during takeoff and landing. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group, for example, shot down 2 Me-262s on October 7, 1944, by catching them in the landing pattern. The jets, low on fuel and with throttles reduced for landing, were virtually helpless against the diving Mustangs. The noose was tightening, not just around German industry, but around its last desperate technological gambits. The laughter of 1943 had become a distant, almost forgotten echo. Part 7. The Final Collapse. Execution, not Combat. By early 1945, the arithmetic of air combat had become not merely difficult, but utterly impossible for Germany. The United States, with its unparalleled industrial might, had produced an astonishing 15,486 P-51s during the war, with approximately 8,000 of them serving in the European theater. At peak strength in March 1945, the 8th Air Force alone operated 14 fighter groups, equipped primarily with Mustangs, totaling well over 1,000 aircraft. Against this overwhelming force, the Luftwaffe could muster perhaps 300 to 400 serviceable fighters on any given day, and those were scattered across the entire Reich, often grounded by critical fuel shortages. Even when aircraft were available, pilot shortages meant those that did fly were often manned by teenagers with minimal training, sent to their deaths against seasoned Allied veterans. The kill ratios reflected this horrifying imbalance. By 1945, Mustang pilots were claiming an unheard-of 10 victories for every loss. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, commanding the 305th Fighter Group, who ended the war with 24 aerial victories, all in Mustangs, observed the grim reality with chilling frankness. By 1945, it wasn't combat. It was execution. We'd find German airfields, circle overhead, and shoot down anyone who tried to take off or land. The Mustang had made all of Germany a combat zone. The skies over Germany had become a free fire zone for Allied fighters, and the Luftwaffe, once the proud spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, was now little more than a phantom force, struggling for survival against an implacable foe. After the war, captured Luftwaffe pilots provided revealing and often devastating testimony about the Mustang's impact. General-Lieutenant Adolf Galland, in his insightful memoirs, eloquently summarized the P-51's decisive role. The P-51 was perhaps the most significant fighter aircraft of World War II. Until it appeared, we had controlled the timing and tempo of air battles over Germany. After it arrived, we never regained the initiative. These were not the words of a junior officer, but of one of the greatest fighter commanders in history, a man who had led the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, Major Heinz Knoke, who survived the war with 33 victories, was even more blunt in his assessment. The Mustang killed the Luftwaffe. Not the bomber offensive, not the invasion, but that fighter that could fly to Poland and back. We went from predators to prey in the span of 3 months. The speed of this reversal, from dominant to defeated, from confident laughter to desperate fear, was truly staggering. Perhaps most poignant was the testimony of the younger pilots who entered combat late in the war. They flew their first missions with minimal training, facing experienced American pilots in superior aircraft. One captured pilot's statement perfectly encapsulated this despair. I flew my first combat mission in November 1944 with 55 hours total flight time. On my third mission, I saw Mustangs for the first time. They were everywhere. I knew then that we had lost not just the war, but the sky itself. For these young men, indoctrinated in a system that promised German superiority, the reality of the Mustang was a brutal, existential shock. It was a tangible, undeniable contradiction to everything they had been taught. The Mustang's contribution extended far beyond tactical victories in dogfights. By enabling deep penetration raids with acceptable losses, it allowed the systematic destruction of German industry, turning the strategic bombing campaign from a costly gamble into an unstoppable force. Oil production, the Wehrmacht's Achilles heel, was reduced to a mere 10% of requirements by March 1945, effectively grounding tanks, trucks, and aircraft. The transportation network was shattered, preventing the movement of troops, supplies, and vital raw materials. Aircraft production, though remarkably maintained at high levels through dispersal into underground factories, became meaningless when there was no fuel to fly the planes, no spare parts for maintenance, or, most tragically, no trained pilots to man them. General Carl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, unequivocally stated, "The P-51 was the decisive weapon system of the European air war. It made possible the daylight bombing campaign, the invasion of Europe, and the systematic destruction of German military power." This was high praise from a high-ranking commander, a clear articulation of the Mustang's unmatched strategic importance. Beyond strategic impacts lay profound human transformation. German pilots who had entered combat in 1943 as confident warriors, full of nationalistic fervor, emerged from the war, if they survived, as changed men. Many spoke of specific moments when they realized the war was truly lost, and almost invariably, these moments were connected to their first encounter with Mustangs deep over Germany. The reality of their vulnerability, so starkly presented, shattered their illusions and often led to deep psychological scars. Some German pilots even experienced a different kind of transformation, moving from enemy to admirer. Many Luftwaffe veterans, after witnessing the overwhelming American material superiority, the advanced technology, and often the humane treatment of prisoners, began to question everything they had been told about their enemies. The stark contrast between Nazi propaganda and the reality they experienced proved devastating to morale and ideology alike. It was difficult to demonize an enemy whose aircraft were undeniably superior, and whose soldiers often treated their captives with respect. The P-51 represented a watershed in fighter design, influencing aircraft development for decades. Its laminar flow wing demonstrated the potential for dramatic drag reduction, a concept that became fundamental in subsequent aircraft designs. The successful integration of British engine technology with an American airframe design established a powerful model for international cooperation that would continue through NATO and other alliances. The Mustang's range achievement fundamentally changed assumptions about fighter aircraft. Pre-war doctrine held that fighters were short-range, point defense weapons, designed to protect specific targets or areas. The P-51 proved that fighters could be strategic weapons, capable of projecting power hundreds of miles from their base, effectively turning the entire enemy nation into a battlefield. This concept would influence everything from the F-86 Sabre in Korea to modern fighters capable of global deployment with aerial refueling. The P-51 didn't just win a war. It rewrote the future of aerial combat. Report 8. The Echoes of Silence, Legacy and Lessons. The final statistics of the Mustang's impact are staggering, yet even they barely scratch the surface of its true significance. Total Mustangs produced 15,086. Enemy aircraft destroyed in air combat, Europe 4,950. Enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground, 4,131. Locomotives destroyed, 9,254. Total combat sorties flown, over 213,873. Total combat hours, over 34,420. Operational losses, 2,520. The kill-to-loss ratio in air combat exceeded an unprecedented 11.1, a figure almost unheard of in the history of aerial warfare. But the true impact of the P-51 Mustang cannot be measured in statistics alone. It broke the Luftwaffe's will to fight. It enabled the successful invasion of Europe by clearing the skies, and by doing so, it undeniably shortened the war by months, if not years, saving countless lives. The transformation from German laughter at unescorted bombers to complete aerial impotence occurred with stunning rapidity. In October 1943, the Luftwaffe controlled the skies over Germany, shooting down bombers seemingly at will. By March 1944, Mustangs were escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe was, for all intents and purposes, combat ineffective. By April 1945, it had ceased to exist as a fighting force. This transformation wasn't gradual. It was catastrophic. The Luftwaffe didn't slowly decline. It collapsed. The appearance of Mustangs deep over Germany triggered a cascade of defeats from which recovery proved impossible. Each lost pilot couldn't be adequately replaced. Each destroyed aircraft further reduced training capability. Each successful escort mission emboldened Allied planners to strike deeper, harder, and more frequently, accelerating the spiral of destruction. German pilot losses tell the story most vividly. 1943, 2,967 pilots lost. 1944, 37 pilots lost. 1945, January to May, 4,238 pilots lost. This devastating attrition also led to a plummeting in average pilot experience. In 1943, a German pilot might have 250-plus flight hours before combat. By early 1944, this was down to 150 hours. By late 1944, it was 80 hours. And by 1945, desperate to fill cockpits, teenagers with a mere 40 to 50 hours of total flight time were being sent up against battle-hardened Allied aces. It was a slaughter. Perhaps the Mustang's greatest achievement was psychological. It shattered the myth of German technological superiority, a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda. It demonstrated the overwhelming power of American industrial capability, and it proved, unequivocally, that democracy could produce better weapons faster than dictatorship. German pilots who had laughed at American bombers in 1943 were, by 1945, refusing to fly suicide missions against Mustang escorted formations, their morale utterly broken. Young Luftwaffe pilots, indoctrinated in Nazi ideology that promised racial superiority and German technical prowess, experienced profound cognitive dissonance when confronting the elegant, powerful, and utterly dominant fighter that controlled the skies over their own homeland. Everything they had been taught about American weakness was contradicted by the brutal reality of the Mustang. In 1985, 4 decades after the war's end, American and German fighter pilots, former enemies, met at a reunion in San Antonio, Texas. The conversations revealed the lasting, indelible impact of the Mustang on both sides. Colonel Clarence "Bud" Anderson, an American ace who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs and scored 16.25 aerial victories, sat across from Oberst Günther Rau, Germany's third highest scoring ace. Anderson raised his glass and said, "To the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that won the air war." Rau, with a profound understanding forged in the crucible of combat, replied, "We had excellent aircraft, superb pilots, and were fighting over our homeland. But you had the Mustang, and that made all the difference." It was a moment of shared respect, acknowledging a truth that transcended the bitterness of war. Walter Schuck, another German ace who had transitioned from FW-190s to Me-262 jets, added his own chilling summary. "We went from laughing at unescorted bombers to taking cover from Mustangs in just 4 months. No military force has ever experienced such a complete reversal." And former Luftwaffe General Johannes Steinhoff, his face still bearing the scars from his Me-262 crash in April 1945, reflected deeply. "We laughed at your bombers in 1943 because we could not imagine that America could produce a fighter with the range to escort them to Berlin. The P-51 Mustang taught us the danger of underestimating one's enemies. You ask when we knew the war was lost. It was that day in March 1944 when we looked up and saw Mustangs over Berlin. At that moment, every German pilot knew the truth. We had already lost." The transformation from German pilots laughing at unescorted American bombers to cowering from Mustang fighters represents one of the most complete and rapid reversals in military history. In less than 6 months, from October 1943 to March 1944, the Luftwaffe went from dominant to defeated, from predator to prey, from confident to condemned. The P-51 Mustang was the catalyst for this transformation, but it represented something larger. American industrial might, democratic cooperation between allies, and the power of technological innovation driven by necessity rather than ideology. German pilots who had been taught that American democracy made the nation weak discovered instead a society capable of unprecedented unity, ingenuity, and production. The laughter of German pilots in October 1943 was based on a reasonable assessment of technical limitations. No single-engine fighter had ever demonstrated the range necessary to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. What they failed to anticipate was American problem-solving capability, the successful marriage of American and British technology, and the industrial capacity to produce thousands of superb fighters in months rather than years. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin on March 4, 1944, the laughter stopped forever. In its place came the terrible recognition that everything German pilots had believed about their enemies, their own superiority, and the likely outcome of the war had been profoundly, tragically wrong. The P-51 Mustang didn't just win the air war. It shattered illusions, destroyed myths, and proved that technological superiority in war comes not from ideology, but from industrial capacity, international cooperation, and democratic innovation. The German pilots who survived never forgot the lesson. In memoirs, interviews, and reunions, they consistently identified the arrival of Mustangs over Germany as the precise moment they knew the war was lost. Not the invasion of Normandy, not the fall of Berlin, but that moment when American fighters appeared where they couldn't be, escorting bombers to the heart of the Reich with fuel to spare for combat. 79 years later, the P-51 Mustang remains the ultimate symbol of American aerial supremacy in World War II. It was the aircraft that silenced the laughter and ended the Reich's mastery of its own skies. The German pilots who laughed in October 1943 learned by March 1944 that they had laughed too soon. By May 1945, most were no longer alive to regret their premature confidence. In the end, this story teaches us the perennial danger of underestimating one's enemies, the unstoppable power of industrial democracy, and the transformative impact a single, well-conceived weapon system can have on the course of history. The Mustang proved that in modern industrial warfare, courage and individual skill, while absolutely necessary, are not sufficient. Victory ultimately belongs to those who can produce the most, train the best, and innovate the fastest. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and devastating. The laughter had become silence, and the P-51 Mustang had etched its name across the skies of Europe as the fighter that ended the Luftwaffe's dominance, and, with it, Nazi Germany's hopes for victory.